So I've now been in office, this is now, I think, my 15th month. And it's been a fascinating time in Sacramento. In my first year, I had the honor to serve as our Assistant Speaker Pro Tem, which means that, as I did in San Francisco City Hall, I have a chance to help run our floor proceedings. And what I would say right now is, like San Francisco, our state, we're at a bit of a crossroads. We have a lot of folks that are doing extremely well, but I think one of the biggest issues that we have facing not just San Francisco, but our state, is the looming inequality that we see between folks who are doing very well and the rest of us who may not be doing quite as well. And many of us who are progressive Democrats are working on policies that will hopefully address what we see as this income inequality crisis, as well as a crisis of increasing poverty. And let me say a few things about that. As far as the top issues that I've been working on, we all know the very number one issue that I have focused probably close to half my time on, and I know many policymakers in San Francisco are spending their time on, is our affordable housing crisis. And a few weeks ago, our speaker appointed me as the chair of the Assembly Housing Committee. This past year, working with some of you in this room, we were able to pass legislation to protect tenants who are victims or survivors of domestic violence to be able to get out of leases more quickly. We passed another bill to protect tenants who are in earthquake vulnerable buildings. But the most disappointing thing I experienced in my first year involved a bill that would have quadrupled the amount of affordable housing tax credit funds available to cities and counties to help fill in the gap of about almost $2 billion that the state has cut when it comes to affordable housing. And my bill, AB 35, was one that garnered 118 out of 120 votes. So this is a bill that not only got full support by Democrats, but almost full support by Republicans. Governor Brown vetoed it in October. Boo is right. Boo is right. And he really has said in recent months he hasn't really been focused on housing. In fact, for those of you who listened, the State of the State address this past week, Governor Brown's 14th such speech, he did not mention the word housing. So I have told my colleagues, and I'm working very closely with my Assembly Democrats, to pull together a significant package, a budget package, a legislative package, to move forward a very aggressive housing policy. And I'm working on that right now, working with my colleagues here in San Francisco. Obviously, we have been ground zero to the housing crisis we have, but lest we all focus on the fact that our city has some of the highest homeowner rates, home prices in the country, some of the highest rents in the country, but up and down the state of California, we have 13 of the 14 most expensive metropolitan areas in the entire country. We have 500,000 homeless kids. We have 1.5 million families that lack access to affordable housing. And we have the highest poverty rate in the country when you include housing costs. So I'm making the pitch to my colleagues. Some of them initially last year said, "Isn't this a San Francisco issue?" And I said, "Oh no, let me show you the statistics in your own communities from San Diego all the way to the North Coast." So housing, as I like to say, is my first, second, and third priority. It's just something I'm probably spending about half my time focused on. A second issue that I've worked on for the better part of this past year involves another indication of sort of what I think of as income inequality. And that has to do with not just the incredible skyrocketing cost of healthcare, but in particular, the costs of healthcare that are being driven by skyrocketing drug prices. Pharmaceutical companies that are pricing medications way above what any of us could afford. So I was drawn to this issue in part, some of you may remember a few years ago that we had Proposition D on the ballot in 2013, really trying to move forward, having San Francisco negotiate lower drug prices. When I got to the state of California, though, last year, in my first month, Governor Brown, he proposed in his budget that we spend $300 million a year on one set of medications for hepatitis C, for pills that cost $1,000 per pill, $100,000 per treatment, completely out of the cost, my guess is, of anyone here, maybe of many of us combined here, to be able to afford. He put $300 million in the budget just to treat 3,500 Californians who have hepatitis C. There are 750,000 Californians who have hepatitis C. And that is one of hundreds of drugs that have seen their prices just skyrocket in recent years. And so I introduced a bill that would, for the first time, require drug companies of high-priced drugs, not all drugs, literally the top 1% of all drugs, to tell us why are your drugs so expensive. If you're making $10 billion a year, as is Gilead, just down the street, which is producing Sovaldi, which is making the Hep C drug, are you spending $9 billion on research and development, or are you spending $1 billion on research and development, and maybe $2 billion on marketing and advertising, and maybe making $5 billion of profit? We don't know yet. So we're moving this bill forward. It's been a very, very difficult bill to move, because despite the fact on our side, we have advocates for seniors and advocates for low-income patients, as well as labor, as well as businesses that are extremely concerned about the cost of health care and drugs. On the other side, pharma has done a great job of bottling this bill up in committee. But that being said, 2016, we're going to have a real debate on this. In part, on November 2016, there will be a ballot measure on this very topic of high-priced drugs. And there is a presidential candidate who feels the burn, who took this very proposal, and it's part of Bernie Sanders' presidential platform. And then a few weeks later, Hillary Clinton rolled out a prescription drug price plan. So this is a topic that's going to be front and center, and we're going to be moving forward on it. Third issue that I've focused on in the state of California, in the legislature, we have the opportunity, unlike when I served in the Board of Supervisors, of doing work on education and schools. And this past year, I spent my time in the education policy area focused on passing an ordinance to require an agency that Raphael and Tom Brown and Bridget and others, we have been focused on to get more accountability by the so-called ACCJC, that accursed agency that's been incredibly difficult. Our bill...
Thanks, David.
Sure thing, Mr. President. I would say because of all of our efforts, not only did this bill pass requiring more transparency and accountability, but for the first time in the last few months, the ACCJC itself has come under state and public attack, not just from San Francisco, but all over the state of California. And we're having conversations right now about how we continue to stabilize the budget and the funding for an institution that is critical to the future of San Francisco. Let me just close with one other topic that I'm focused on, which may have ended up taking on an interest more significant than anything that I've done thus far. I introduced, in the wake of San Bernardino, the first significant gun control bill. We are going to have a major debate this year in Sacramento and in the state of California about gun control. My bill specifically would recategorize hundreds of thousands of weapons that look like, that act like, that sound like assault weapons, but are technically not under the law, would categorize a whole slew of guns that fall under a certain exception, recategorize them as assault weapons under California's assault weapons ban. One of the shooters in San Bernardino used a gun that was a so-called bullet button gun. And we're going to make sure that we're moving this forward. I have to say, when we announced this, I received more expressions of dissatisfaction, shall we say, on my Facebook. If you want to see some truly ugly Facebook posts, feel free to visit my Facebook accounts. Look at some of the accounts around the time when we introduced this bill about a week ago. I would say the speech is violent. There are some individuals that refer to wanting to use some of their weapons and bring them to San Francisco. A little discouraging, but that being said, I've been having meetings with a number of my Democratic colleagues. We are planning to move forward a significant gun control package, and stay tuned as we take on the NRA and their friends.
Yes.
Let me just close by saying that 2016 is going to be a very exciting year. Obviously, we have a lot of exciting races locally, but at the national level, we have some great candidates moving forward, and whether you're feeling the burn or ready for Hillary, I hope that we will all be engaged in making sure that at the national level we have leadership that continues on. And I know this is a club that came out in 2004 in response to someone who really was inspiring at the local and national level. And I know that all of you will be very engaged throughout this entire year. So with that, thank you for your time, and happy to answer any questions. Sure.
sometime around 5th or 6th grade, I learned that 118 out of 120 votes is enough for a veto override. But in the real world, do authors of bills ever submit their bills for overrides, or does everybody just go along to get along anymore?
So that's a great question. So in October, when Governor Brown vetoed our bill, and we were very surprised with the veto because, to talk about my bill, I mentioned before that in recent years we've lost close to $2 billion of funding that we used to invest in affordable housing. And given that we're finally in a slight surplus time, I thought, let's talk about, and this was what the bill was, let's talk about an additional $300 million, 0.25% of the state budget, which would have leveraged close to $2 billion of federal and private sector dollars to build more affordable housing up and down the state. And this is a bill that was supported on all the way from progressive tenant folks in San Francisco to chambers of commerce that know if we don't build more housing, we won't have places for workers. So we had hundreds of organizations that had signed on, no opposition, 118 out of 120 votes. And when it was vetoed, I naively asked my staff, I asked them the same question. Don't we have this rule 2/3 override of a veto? And my staff explained to me that there had not been a successful veto, override of a gubernatorial veto into the state of California since Governor Jerry Brown's first term 40 years ago. And there have been some attempts, but generally what it requires, as you can imagine, it requires the leadership of the Democratic and Republican caucuses in both houses to agree to that. And that's just a very, very difficult proposition. Now that being said, we put the inquiry into our leadership. And I know there was a tiny little bit of discussion around this. In fact, there was an article about, is this maybe the year we may try to do it? But unfortunately, it was not meant to be. And we are mobilizing for a big fight this year around housing.
Yeah.
Other questions? Yes.
Yes, this is on a different topic. I'm an instructor in the music department at City College in San Francisco.
Yep.
Madeline, you were the chair, tells me that you are a violinist.
I am a past violinist, yes.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
And I look forward to hearing you play at some point. But anyway,
I'm not sure if you enjoyed it this month.
I'm not enjoying it, but I would act like I enjoy it. So that's the important thing. Anyway, I'm wondering if you have anything to say from your vantage point.
Yeah.
If you know anything about the completion of the Performing Arts Education Center at City College. If you're up on any of this.
I am a little bit. In fact, I think, Tom, we might have been talking about this. In fact, last year at one of these SF for Democracy events.
Exactly.
Yeah, so, let me say a few things. I often, despite the fact I don't play the violin today, and I'm a terrible violinist at the moment, when I was in grade school and high school, the violin was what really kept me going and kept me motivated and taught me discipline and taught me how to stand in front of people and not completely freak out. Music education was incredibly important to me. And so when I was on the Board of Supervisors, I was a big supporter of the School of the Arts. And music and arts education, I think, has to be fundamental to who we are. And in fact, one of the things that I put in place with Supervisor Jane Kim was a fund that came out of the profits that we've seen, not the profits, the property tax revenues that we've seen in the Tenderloin area around the Twitter building into a fund for nonprofit organizations and arts organizations to help stabilize rents for their buildings. So that is important to me. Now that being said, as you probably know, arts funding in the state of California is ranked 50 out of 50 states on when it comes per capita. It's one of the, it's not something we prioritize at all. And in fact, speaking to the arts community, when I went to Sacramento, I started talking to colleagues like, hey, who's working on arts funding? I only found one colleague who was willing to talk about, partner with me around arts funding. In fact, Ian Calderon, who represents Los Angeles, who happens to be the chair of a committee that has arts as its jurisdiction. So we've been chatting about arts funding, and in fact, I've been talking to the arts community in the Bay Area about a bill that I may be carrying this year, potentially in the area of the arts and how to reduce some costs in the state that impact artists. But all that being said, I know that there's this long conversation around this music building at City College, bit controversial. lots of questions over the years. I'm more than happy to re-engage in that conversation. I think, Tom, you were in touch with one of my staffers last year about it. I'd love to just get an update. To see. It was Judson, who's my chief of staff. I think some of you know Judson, who was one of my aides at City Hall for years. But I'm more than happy to chat about what's happening or not happening in the building to see if we can do something forward. Okay?
Question behind you.
Yes. Hey.
Hi. My quick question is just a point of clarification. You indicated in your pharma bill
Yeah.
to try to find out exactly where this huge windfall that you see goes to. Is there any teeth to force them to do anything about it? Or is this just going to be a bill to garner information in order to do something later on?
Yeah, so let me explain a little bit about the bill. I think many of you know that the pharmaceutical industry is a monopoly industry. What that means is if you are so lucky to devote the research and development to create a drug, you are granted by the federal government with a patent, which is usually anywhere from 10 to 15, 17 years, to produce that drug and to sell it at whatever price you want and make as much profit as you want. It's really the only industry that does that. In other industries where you have monopolies, monopolistic companies are required to provide information to government on why their rates are set a certain way. Let me give two examples. Utilities, right? If you're PG&E, you have to submit to the California Public Utilities Commission what are your costs and what is the appropriate and fair rate of return. That's not the case when it comes to drug companies. And in fact, in every other industrialized country in the world, we have drug price controls. So the very drugs that I was referring to for hepatitis C, which costs $1,000 a pill here in the state of California, if you go to England, it costs a third less. If you go to Egypt or you go to India and you have hepatitis C, that drug costs $10 a pill. So there's something just fundamentally wrong about this. And at the same time, if you look at the healthcare sector, we all know we've been trying to clamp down on healthcare costs for a long time. First, we went to doctors and we said, you need to be transparent about your costs. And right now, the most recent estimate is doctors' average incomes are going down about 2% a year, all right? Then we went to hospitals and said, man, hospitals are making a lot of money. And we required, under the Affordable Care Act, transparency of hospital dollars. And hospitals are making 2 to 3% a year. Then we went to health plans, insurance companies, health insurance companies, which some might say those bad health insurance companies. We required them to justify their rate increases. Right now, their rate increases about a year, 3 to 5%. There's one sector in the healthcare world that we're not required to do this. You know what it is? It's the pharmaceutical industry. And this past year, the major pharmaceutical companies, their average corporate profits, 15 to 20%. So go figure, right? So all that being said, my legislation is meant to provide transparency, to understand where's the money going, and it has the teeth in that it would be state law requiring companies to basically provide us a level of information we've never had. And I think given how hard pharmaceutical companies have been fighting us, they are extremely worried that opening up the books may mean something when it comes to how we as policymakers have a chance to control healthcare prices. And in fact, the company that produced hepatitis C, we started focusing on them about a year ago. And you may know in Sacramento, we had a number of hearings about it. The US Senate investigated this situation, 10,000 pages, and a bipartisan committee found that the corporate executives set the prices not to recoup research and development costs, but to maximize profits. And I think many of you also know, in the last couple of months, there was a pharma CEO who was handcuffed, literally handcuffed, for defrauding investors. And so the time has come, I think, after many, many years, for us to finally unveil what's behind the costs, but it's going to take a lot of work, and I will tell you, we've brought this bill through committee a couple times. It's being jammed just in its first committee, but we're not going to stop. We're going to keep fighting. It's going to be a long fight this year.
One last question. Can you give us I missed your opening, can you give us an update on fracking? If there's going to be any, apparently the governor is still reluctant to close down the use of state water for that, and it's a health issue, major proportions.
I have to say, one of the more, I've mentioned a couple things that I was a little bummed about my first year. I'm a freshman, so I'm just, learning my way through the halls in Sacramento, one of the disappointing fights that we had this year is we tried to establish some new rules that impacted the oil industry. And what I discovered very quickly is we do not have a majority, despite the fact that Democrats represent 51 of 80 in the state assembly. We don't have a majority of Democrats that are willing to stand up vis-a-vis the oil industry and say, you know what, we need to regulate or tax or otherwise protect the environment. So it was very clear. In fact, I would say at this point there are probably 30 votes, those of us who are willing to stand up on the line and do that. But there are many of our colleagues who are not. And this is an industry that knows how to play the political game in a very sophisticated way. And so the environmentalist community this year, we've had to regroup. After the biggest environmental bill that the state of California was considering last year, which was SB 350, which set new goals around renewable energies and green buildings, we were unable to set goals when it came to efficiencies in cars and how we ask the oil industry to help us. And so I have to say at the moment, I'm not hopeful with the current configuration that we're going to be able to have a majority of votes to do that, but there's always November 2016, and we just need to continue to build support of environmentalists around the state that are willing to step up to the line and say, we need to do better.
Great. Thank you, Assemblyman.
Thank you, and thank you.
Now let's get back to this use of force. As you see in the graph on the right is the San Francisco police use of force, and the bar graph is higher than all of the rest of them put together per officer. So it's been going on for decades. It's sort of like a culture of impudence. And the Police Officers Association, they're mighty, they're powerful. They were very powerful. So, it's like it took a newspaper to compile the use of force records through public records requests to learn that the San Francisco Police Department has a group of violent officers, a core group, but I'm not saying they're all like that, but there are a group who shouldn't work with the public, and the reason they are is because there's no sort of an oversight to compile the evidence against these officers, and so the Police Officers Association endorsed Vicki Hennessy for sheriff, and of course she's not going to tolerate dissent, which is protesters at City Hall who protest are not, well, I'll get to that later, but not enough progressives voted for Ross Mercarini. Ross tolerated political dissent. I loved how during his last hour as sheriff, he allowed protesters to loudly heckle Ed Lee being sworn in by the Governor Brown, as mayor. And they had to shout at each other to hear each other being sworn in. And after Willie Brown blamed Ross, blasted Ross, of course he's one of the media's favorite whipping boys. And but Ross did allow peaceful protests and loud ones at that. That's okay. There was no violence, but there were a few arrests there. I didn't go. I meant to, but. So our new sheriff will communicate with ICE, which is the Immigration Customs Enforcement. So immigrants, all bets are off. They're going to start breaking up families. And also the Police Officers Association is now joined with the new Sheriff Hennessy, of course. They endorsed her, so why wouldn't they be? And she was also endorsed by the private prison industry. Ross wasn't. So that tells you something. So in December, the Police Officers Association who opposed they opposed shields. Those were proposed as defense against knife-wielding suspects. So, also in December, the San Francisco Police Department tightened its rules around pointing a gun at a suspect, also opposed by, you guessed it, the Police Officers Association. So, should the cops shoot a fleeing suspect? Well, kind of like my dad was shot by the police because they didn't chase him down, they just shot him. He was unarmed, running away, and they shot him in the back. So they, every time an officer pulls their gun, they have to report it. Those are according to the new SFPD rules about pulling your weapon. And they have to articulate the reason for pointing the firearm. Marty Halloran, the president, who used to be the treasurer way back when, of the Police Officers Association, opposes it. He opposes having to report officers pointing their guns, saying tasers save, and he also says the tasers save lives. So, and bless Supervisor David Campos, and he's the greatest. He says that de-escalation needs a fundamental change. Now, de-escalation is sort of like maybe, for example, those Swedish cops that were on vacation in New York, instead of pulling weapons, they were tourists, they just grabbed somebody who was having a mental health episode somewhere in New York and just grabbed him and held him so he couldn't move and talked him down and then let him go, They even stroked his head like a kitty cat. I think that might help. They had a technique and it worked that time. So, and our officers could learn from that. De-escalation. See, and Mario Woods, he had a mental health episode. Of course, it seems like he was having one. And the police and jails aren't equipped here in San Francisco aren't equipped to handle mental health patients, and even the hospitals are barely equipped. They don't have beds for them, and we don't chase fleeing suspects. We might shoot them, before we. It's just there's countries that think we're crazy here in America we're just gun crazy. Cops are gun crazy. We're just the Second Amendment is practically the only civil right we've got left, and except when the black people started trying to carry guns, and then they had to have gun regulation. I remember that back in the 60s.